Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Welcome to the second installment of Tier 2 albums. These are albums that are going to be going up against everything we listened to in January and February of this year, and we're going to be using them to refine and find the best albums so that we have a really good idea about what our top 20 will look like at the end of the year. Some of these albums are old, some of these albums are new. It's just been stuff that's new to me recently, and I want to share it out with you guys. And as I stated on the last post, I am habitually an album listener. That's the unit of music that I listen to. And as a person who listens to albums in that way, I've been finding it interesting to look at albums and figure out what it is about them that I think holds them together as a unit, as a holistic statement. And each of these albums that you'll see in this post kind of play with tension in different ways. Some build pressure, some stretch it out, and some just build inside of it. But they all resolve in ways that you might not expect. So let's get started with Fishbone's Stockholm Syndrome. Me and Fishbone go way, way back. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, the album Truth and Soul was more than just an album. It was something that was passed around, and it had weight depending upon who gave it to you. Well, I still personally hold that album as an all-time classic, but for some reason, Fishbone has always kind of eluded mainstream recognition, not unlike King's X. They're critically acclaimed, but still have never really been a major figure in the public eye. And even in the mid-90s, they had a run of slightly uneven albums, and I sort of fell off and stopped following them. So when Stockholm Syndrome showed up, their first album in 19 years, kind of felt like it had something to prove. It wasn't really a casual release. And I think one of the things that brings Fishbone back is focus. Look, if you'd have told me in 1989 that Fishbone would have released the protest album that I didn't even know I needed in 2025, I would not have known what you were talking about. Yet very clearly, Stockholm Syndrome approaches the current American moment in a very real way, and it doesn't do so very carefully. In fact, the title tells you everything. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological condition in which prisoners don't know that they're imprisoned. It is a characteristically on-the-nose Fishbone allegory, but Fishbone has never really been one for subtle framing. They find an idea, they commit to it, and they take it all the way through to the end. And the directness of the album shows up immediately. The lead track, Last Call in America, leaves no room for interpretation. But Fishbone also shows they can write a song that's a character study on a guy who wants to join ICE in the song Secret Police. The commentary is unrelenting, unblinking, and unapologetic. It doesn't soften itself, and it doesn't hold back. But what keeps it from collapsing under the weight of this narrative is how the band moves stylistically from one thing to the other. I see this in many ways as a spiritual successor to Truth and Soul, and as such, the stylistic ground is never steady. Ska snaps to punk, funk turns into something even heavier, and then it gives way to moments that are unexpectedly open and perhaps even vulnerable. The shifts are abrupt and sometimes jarring, but they're not random. They feel responsive, as if the music is adjusting in real time to the pressure that they're relieving. At the center of all this is, of course, lead singer D'Angelo Moore. His defiantly unique identity anchors the album in a very inexplicable way. There's a distance in how he presents himself. It's a little theatrical and a little aloof, but it's never really disconnected. He's inside and outside of the moment at the same time, both observing and participating like some kind of liminal voodoo loa that's walking within the world of men and commenting on their folly. But as important as D'Angelo Moore's contributions are, Fishbone has always worked best when they work as a unit. And this isn't really the classic, lineup of Fishbone. Really, the only two members that still remain from the classic lineup are D'Angelo Moore and keyboardist and trombonist Christopher Dowd. But there is a collaborative feeling on this album that really gives it a classic Fishbone feel. But I will say that Dowd's presence is critical. His keyboard and his trombone work are important, but more broadly, his songwriting skills and his arranging skills ground the work that Fishbone is doing. And that allows the album to cohere into something very deliberate. And by the time you get to the last track, Love is Love, when things open to something spiritual or almost gospel in tone, it doesn't feel like a departure as much as it feels like a release that's been earned.
Every day the story stays the same, and the guns keep firing, and it's always us that takes the blame. Every day we're dying, it seems as though the world is gone insane. Now the people asking why? Last call in America. Last call in America. Last call in America.
Next up I got King Buffalo, The Burden of Restlessness. This album took me a while to step into. It's been sitting on my Bandcamp wishlist for the better part of 5 years now, and I keep coming back to it with the intention of removing it. I would let it play, and then I would get interested, and then I would move on, and I would never really quite commit to it. But I also never quite removed it from the realm of possibility, because The Burden of Restlessness was composed and recorded during COVID, and it purposefully captures the isolation of lockdown. It's claustrophobic, but not in a crowded way. It's more like being alone for too long with your own thoughts, watching patterns repeat helplessly. It reminded me a little bit of the darker moments of Bo Burnham's Inside. Not the funny stuff, but the parts where you see him almost breaking down because the isolation around him makes the space feel both too small and too open and endless at the same time. Now, on paper, King Buffalo sits in a pretty clearly Tool-adjacent territory. They play in odd meters, but they don't really play with the kind of depth and polyrhythmic complexity that Tool reaches for. The rhythms are more grounded and more direct, both fracturing and extending time in the process of their unfolding. Long, pulsing bass pedal tones drive pointillistic, angular guitar riffs, with everything locked into a slow, deliberate movement that never quite resolves. In addition, the vocals play a pretty important role in its claustrophobic tone. They're not driving melody in the traditional sense as much as they're providing texture. They have a dry closeness that kind of reflects Chad Clark's vocals from Beauty Pill, but they feel like they're right up against you. There's no distance, there's no reverb to open things up. And this creates this near constant ASMR quality where it feels like the voice is right beside you, uncomfortably in a chair, whispering in your ear, sitting in the same claustrophobic loop as everything else. This in some ways limits the dynamic range, but it really captures the vibe of the album. And that's where the tension in this album lives, because the music is full of energy. It's simmering the entire time and only boils over in small measure. And you can definitely hear where a release could happen, where, a band like Tool might actually explode outward. But King Buffalo doesn't do that, at least not to the same extent. Even in their most cathartic moments, they hold it back and let the pressure build and then stretch it further instead of releasing it. And that shouldn't work. At a certain point, it almost feels like formula: cycle, build, repeat, hold. But the longer you stay with it, the more it feels like that repetition is intentional. And it feels less like stagnation and more like containment. The dynamics are there, but they're internal. Loud and soft, dense and sparse, all shifting just enough to keep the surface moving while the core is locked. So what you're left with is this really strange combination: intensity that almost feels lethargic, a sense of something constantly about to give, but choosing not to. Next up I got Craven Sidings. Now, during my COVID experience, I kind of went down the modular synthesis rabbit hole. I never got particularly good, but I definitely gained enough perspective to see how much the instrument shapes the outcome. In modular synthesis, you're not really composing in the traditional sense. You're creating a music-making system and then letting it loose to see what it does. This sort of exploratory, plug it in and see what happens approach to music writing is the approach that Craven takes in his music. And that's exactly how Sidings feels. The music isn't imposed on the instrument as much as it emerges from it. But this doesn't mean that he's at the mercy of the instrument. As a matter of fact, Craven has a very clear idea about what he's trying to do. Sidings represents a very intentional vision, inspired by the post-industrial landscape of the Yorkshire countryside, specifically the remnants of past labor and abandoned structures. For me personally, the rippling arpeggios and muted beats on Sidings was much more evocative of like a lunar landing than it would have been an English countryside in my mind. But understanding the album's intent and the affordances of modular synthesis suggests a little bit more visceral interpretation, because knowing the intent behind this album allows me to hear those pulsing patterns like echoes of something that used to move with urgency, but now is reduced to some kind of just a memory, like the ghost of train lines long since stilled, echoing back through the past. The album stretches across 3 long tracks, each one framed by a shorter rail-themed piece. The deep, warm low end carries a lot of the weight of the album, but these are carefully shaped into textures and rhythms that feel insistent without over-pushing. In some ways, Sidings is kind of spiritually connected to minimalist pieces like Music for 18 Musicians or Kanikatsi. Like those pieces, sequences repeat, patterns cycle, and the music's glacial evolution is slow enough that it almost disappears. By all objective standards, it should fade to the background, or at least feel uneventful. But instead, it builds momentum almost immediately, not through change, but through continuity. And the longer it runs, the more that momentum becomes immersive. The small shifts start to matter, and the textures deepen, and the repetition stops feeling repetitive and starts feeling structural. So Sidings doesn't really push forward as much as it just keeps going and pulls you along with it. Next up I got Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith's Gush. Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith is another artist I've been following for a while, but only as far back as 2017 when her album Ears came out. That was my entry point for me, and I was really fascinated by her explorations of the Buchla synthesizer, which is an instrument that was developed alongside and at the same time as the Moog synthesizer, but unlike Bob Moog, Buchla resisted attaching a piano keyboard to it as a controller, instead leading into a more modular sequential approach. That album felt very exploratory and a little bit avant-garde, but still completely immersive. The music didn't feel performed as much as it felt grown. But on Gush, all of those explorations seem to have allowed Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith to tame the instrument to a degree. Her unique world-building approach hasn't really gone anywhere, but it's been absorbed into something a lot more intentional. And as a result, Gush feels like an album that's innately connected to bodily experience, which stands to reason. Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith has emerged as a dedicated yoga practitioner and has actually recorded albums specifically for the purpose of yoga practice. But this album feels directly connected to a more broad sense of movement. And I think that connection comes in part from the way that she experiences sound in the first place. Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith has a type of synesthesia that doesn't show up as colors, but instead as urges, responses in the body that guides what she does next. And I think that you can hear that here. The sounds don't just sit in the mix, they feel positioned, like they're meant to land in specific places. I also think that her unique and distinctive vocal approach reflects her unique connection with sound. Her voice on this album has its own kind of ASMR quality. It's processed, shaped, diffused into the texture, but not in a way that distances it. If anything, it pulls you further in. There's an almost physical quality to it, as if it's been digitally attuned to certain centers of your brain, rather than carrying meaning in a traditional sense. You don't follow the vocals as much as you register them, more like sensation than language. And that's where this album starts to hold, because it lives in this space between control and unpredictability. The structures are loose and the sounds are constantly shifting, and yet it never really feels unstable. There's a sense that everything is responding to touch, to motion, to something internal. It's not random, it's reactive. And with repeated listens, that reactivity starts to feel embodied. The album connects to physical experience in a way that's really hard to pin down, less visual and more somatic. You don't follow it so much as you get in sync with it, and even at its most abstract, it feels grounded in something human, empathic, aware, and constantly shifting. It doesn't lock into a shape, it keeps adapting, and somehow that's what allows it to cohere. Next up I got the Beths, Straight Line Was a Lie. This is another album that I came into it with some expectations already set. The album previous to this one, Expert in the Dying Field, had a really strong run for me in 2024. It made it all the way to the finals just to get bumped out by the band formerly known as the Guess Who, and ended up with an honorable mention. All throughout its run, I kept on coming back to this one phrase: the Beths have the songs. But I was admittedly apprehensive about Straight Line Was a Lie because following up that album felt like a daunting task. And the first thing that I noticed about it is how much it pulls back. It's just a little. The sharper power pop edges are still there in flashes, but they're not driving things along in the same way. Instead, Straight Line Was a Lie leans into something a little more open, a jangly 90s power pop, Bangles adjacent sound. But although the surface is lighter, the structure underneath is just as precise. One of the ways they manage this shift is in the sequencing of the album. The sharper, more immediate tracks sit alongside songs that take their time and open up to something a little more reflective. It's not a dramatic contrast as much as it is just sort of a balancing act. The album cleverly moves between these various modes without calling attention to it, like it's adjusting its weight as it goes. And I think at the center of this general shift is lead singer and songwriter Elizabeth Stokes. And there's a noticeable change, I think, in how these songs are written. And she's talked pretty openly about having to relearn how to write music after starting to take SSRIs, apparently with what she calls a new brain. And I think you can hear that. The lyrics still land with clarity, but the tone's a little bit different now. And the Beths aren't the first band to make this kind of shift away from edge and more towards restraint. But very often it can flatten things out. It could have taken away the urgency that made their earlier work hit so hard. But here it doesn't. The melodies are still precise and beautiful. The hooks are still there. And you can really hear this in songs like Till My Heart Stops or Mosquitoes. But they don't arrive with the same kind of insistence. they do so very naturally. And that ease doesn't weaken the album, it gives it more range. And by the time you work through the whole sequence of the album, the balance becomes the point. Nothing is overstated, but nothing feels too slight either. It's carefully measured without being overly calculated. So in the end, Straight Line Wasn't a Lie doesn't push as hard, it opens up instead, and the album is stronger for it.
You need the middle in your blood to keep you alive, and you read the compass in your eyes so you can stay right. So you surf the Earth's magnetic core to keep you aligned. So you need the middle in your blood to keep you alive, keep you alive.
And finally I got Lunatic Soul's debut album. This is one of those albums that asks something from you right away. Not effort exactly, but intention. It's definitely a play it loud in the dark kind of record. If you give it that space, it opens, and if you don't, it's just going to pass you by. Now again, I've been following Lunatic Soul for several years now, and their album World Under Unsun was released last year and rocketed up to at the end of the year to the top 5 position. So I wanted to go to the beginning of this project. And I wasn't just curious where it started, I wanted to hear how much of the band's identity was already there at the outset. This was released in 2008 as the first entry in Maurice Duda's side project. And this is supposed to be a project that contrasted his work with the progressive rock group Riverside. And where Riverside leaned into more progressive rock and progressive metal, this one feels immediately different in many ways. Most importantly, it has no electric guitars in it at all, and that's a constraint that he's kept throughout the entire Lunatic Soul catalog. And that alone shifts everything towards something more ambient and a little more inward. The album itself follows a concept, and one that will carry out through the entire Lunatic Soul catalog, a journey through the afterlife that was inspired by someone Duda knew that experienced clinical death. But in this case, instead of telling that story directly, it unfolds in fragments, instrumental passages, and sparse vocal lines, and often long stretches where atmosphere does the work of lyrics. And that's where I think this album starts to separate itself, because albums like this, especially early on in a project, can feel kind of tentative, like the artist is trying to figure out how far they can push the idea. But that's not what's happening here. Even though this is the very first entry in the Lunatic Soul catalog, the idea, the vision remains complete. Maybe not quite as expansive as what happens later, but definitely fully formed, with only perhaps the drums showing a hint of rawness. And what doesn't work, but actually does, is how little it relies on traditional songwriting. There are long stretches where nothing happens in the traditional sense. No hooks, no clear peaks, no resolution to lean into. And again, it risks slipping past you entirely. But it doesn't, because the atmosphere contains intention. Each piece feeds into the next, building a sense of continuity that's more emotional than structural. You're not following a sequence of songs as much as you're moving and traveling through a space. And that's really the key to Lunatic Soul. It's not immediate, it requires patience. But if you give it that space, it can be deeply immersive. And at its core, this album is asking a pretty heavy question. How do our choices shape what we leave behind? And by the end, there's really no easy resolution. In fact, the protagonist comes to understand that being remembered in your living life means that you may have to give up your identity in the afterlife. And that's a quiet, unsettling idea. And the album leaves it there.
I glimpse the spirits of my relatives. I see the others that mean
Each of these albums holds tension differently. Some push it, some stretch it, and some just live inside it. They don't rely on the same structures, they don't resolve in the same way, but they all find something that keeps them moving. Different approaches, same result. They all stay with you. And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends, and also follow me over on Spotify. I've got a big playlist that's always growing with example tracks from all these albums. And if you want to help me choose the best albums of this whole mess of 150 albums we'll be listening to throughout the course of this year, find the best 20, please sign up for my Patreon below. And until I see you guys next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.